We're going to move now from ecosystem services into more of a human focus on this. Dr. Dilys is the principal researcher and team leader at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and she's going to talk to us about poverty and conservation learning, I think.
So I'm going to talk about nature-based livelihoods. I apologise, I've got a very croaky voice, which is getting croakier by the minute, but hopefully it will last out for the 10 minutes that I've got. So I thought it would be nice to just start with this quote from a paper by David Kaimovitz and Doug Scheel about the value of biodiversity and nature to people. So for hundreds of millions of people, biodiversity is about eating, about staying healthy and finding shelter. Such needs, in addition to those of the tiger and other endangered species, must also be considered a conservation priority. Clearly it's not a question of either or, but rather of finding a better balance. And it's a statement that I agree very strongly with, and one where I'm not sure we've got the balance right just yet. So first of all, what are nature-based livelihoods? Well, there are many different types. I'm focusing in this presentation on people living predominantly in developing countries, in rural areas of developing countries. So you've got a number of people that are directly reliant on using wild nature to meet their day-to-day subsistence needs. So you've got your bushmeat hunters, you've got your collectors of non-timber forest products, you've got your fishermen, and so on and so forth. And then you've got those that are directly dependent on domesticated nature, pastoralists that graze livestock, small-scale farmers that rely on agricultural biodiversity to maintain their livelihoods. And nature also provides opportunities for people to set up enterprises as tourist guides and in other enterprises, or to get jobs that are based on nature, working in protected areas and so on. So there's a whole different mix of livelihoods that can be based on nature, and quite often poor people don't just have one or the other, they'll have a mix of these different livelihoods within their overall livelihood strategy. And then it's also important to remember that nature also supports livelihoods more broadly, not just through the products that it generates that people can use, but also the services that it provides and the safety nets that it provides. So it provides a source of food for people in times of famine, it provides ecosystem services which support soil productivity, it helps people adapt to climate change, and so on. So how many people rely on nature for their livelihoods? Well, we all do to some extent. We all know that biodiversity and nature underpin essential ecosystem services on which we're all dependent. But poor people in rural areas are far more directly dependent on nature than many of us are. And I just think a couple of statistics are relevant here. Over 70% of the world's poor live in rural areas and are dependent on nature to support their livelihoods to some degree. So 3/4 of the 2.6 billion people who live on less than $2 a day, so those are the ones that are classified as poor, officially poor by the World Bank, are dependent upon local natural resources to support their livelihoods. So it's a lot of people. So just some indicative figures here about the extent and the scale of that dependency, picking up a couple of ecosystems. So forests, it's estimated that approximately 240 million people live in forested ecosystems, and approximately 1.6 billion rural people are dependent on forests to some extent. And just one forest ecosystem, mangroves, are really, really important. Millions of people in developing countries rely on mangroves for all or part of their livelihoods, and for a variety of products that the mangroves produce, so the fish as well as the wood and the other forest products. Fisheries, over 38 million fishers in developing countries, and up to 150 million people if you take into account the associated processing and marketing that goes with that. In Africa alone, 30 to 45 million people dependent on fish for their livelihoods. And again, zooming in onto one particular ecosystem, coral reefs, about 500 million people have some level of dependence upon coral And rangelands, another really important ecosystem for poor people. 1 billion people live in arid and semi-arid rangelands in Africa. So it's 10% of the population of the continent. And it's a much higher proportion if we just focus on those that are considered to be poor. These derive all or most of their livelihoods directly from these lands. So these really are significant numbers of people that we're talking about that depend on nature, and particularly on the proportion of the world's population which is counted as poor. But I think it's really important to remember that it's not all about wild nature. Agriculture is the foundation of rural livelihoods in Africa and in most of the developing world. 65% of the African population, more than 80% in some African countries, depends on farming as their primary source of livelihood. And without expensive external inputs, productive agriculture in these cases depends on a healthy natural resource base and functioning ecosystem services. Poor people don't have fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, and weed and pest controls to use, so they're highly dependent on natural pollinators, natural fertilizers, and so on. And I think it's important to remember agriculture and nature are sometimes pitted as being at odds with each other, but agriculture can look like this over here. You can see forest on the one hand. This is windy forest in Uganda, and you can see agriculture right up to the forest boundary, and you can see it clearly has had a massive impact on the forest. But agriculture can also look like this. This is an agroforestry system where you've got cropping interspersed with trees, and it's high biodiversity. The two are existing alongside each other quite harmoniously. So how much nature should we protect? I was asked to see if I could come up with some kind of target or figures for how much was needed, but I found this really, well, impossible to do, because I think it depends on what we count as nature, where we protect it, and fundamentally how we go about that protection process. So in terms of what, going back to the slide I showed earlier about the kinds of resources and the types of ecosystems that are important to poor people, I think it's important to remember that the majority of nature-based livelihoods are focused on meeting basic needs. So it's about food, fodder, shelter, and so on. Jobs in protected areas and tourism enterprises provide a livelihood for some, but not for the majority. So if we want to support nature-based livelihoods, we need to focus on the places where many people rely on declining resources with few substitutes. So this includes the ones I was showing here, the mangroves, the coral reefs, and the rangelands. All of these ecosystems are in decline, and for example, more than a third of the world's mangrove forests have disappeared in the last 2 decades alone, and it's estimated the annual rate of loss is of the order of 6,000 square kilometres. But bearing in mind the point I made earlier about the fuzzy line between nature-based livelihoods and agriculture-based livelihoods, we also need to focus on lands that support smallholder agriculture. This includes centres of plant diversity, sites of biocultural heritage. So the map here shows the areas where a high conservation priority for species that are important for crop agriculture. But these sites are quite often different to those that are prioritised by conservation agencies, and for example the maps that Ali showed earlier. But given current trajectories in population growth and food demand, it's absolutely critical that we think about how agricultural land can also be supported, as well as what we consider as wild land. So a better question than how much should we protect might be how and by whom should we protect nature? First of all, I think we need to clarify what we mean by protection. Protection doesn't necessarily mean formal protected areas that currently contribute to the 17% target. So much more land already exists and is well managed under indigenous land holdings and customary tenure. Recent research by the Rights and Resources Initiative that you may have come across shows that approximately 2/3 of the world's land area is under customary land tenure and accounts for 80% of the world's biodiversity. So most of the world's biodiversity is outside of formal protected areas and outside what is currently being counted towards the 17% target. most of the customary land that's out there is still government owned. So not all of this 2/3 of the world land area will contribute towards space for nature. It's government owned, and it means that both the local people that live there and the nature on which they depend are threatened by destructive development practices and large-scale land acquisitions. So affording communities legal recognition of their land empowers them both not to just meet their livelihoods, but also to better protect nature. And again, evidence from the Rights and Resources Initiative shows that, at least in the case of community-managed forests, these produce better conservation outcomes than forests that are under other governance structures. So going back to the question of space for nature, I think if we're concerned about both nature and nature-based livelihoods, governance of nature is the key issue to address. I think if we get the governance right, the space for nature will start to follow. So I think, just to end with Harvey's final point, yes, let's speak up for nature, but let's not do it in a vacuum and not set it aside from people. Thank you.